Hello and welcome to World History B, Unit 8, Cold War Tensions. So beginning in the 70s, on the surface level, it looked as if the Cold War was starting to thaw. Relationships between Soviet Union and America and China and America were starting to improve. They were starting to become more peaceful. A lot of that does have to do with United States President Richard M. Nixon, who had this philosophy, as did many of his advisors, of realpolitik, which is basically an approach towards politics and diplomacy based on the reality of the situation before you and not just based on ideology. So rather than going to someone and saying, well, this is what I believe, and you either go with it or you don't because this is just our culture and this is what we think and you have to respect it. Instead, you go to someone and go, okay, this is what I'm thinking. I'm hearing what your side of the argument is. Let's see if we can come to a compromise where I don't get everything I want, but you don't get everything you want, and maybe we find a peace in between. And this worked, at least on the surface level. Also, much credit needs to be given to the leaders of the Soviet Union, who recognized that their former leader Stalin was not a good leader. He was not a good representation of the Soviet Union and what they were trying to accomplish and achieve in their country, and they began a process called de-Stalinization, which means just like it sounds. The taking down of Stalin's statues, his memories, renaming the city of Stalingrad, basically trying to take down anything that looks like it celebrates or worships or glorifies anything at all having to do with Stalin, as now the attitude towards Stalin is he was a terrible leader and we want to move forward into a new world, a new relationship with the nations around us, especially the West. Leonid Brezhnev, the leader after Nikita Khrushchev stepped down, became the leader in '64, and while he absolutely does deserve credit for taking the initiative to try to open up relationships with the U.S. and bring down some of the heat of the Cold War that had happened as a result of events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, back home, while he was on the face anti-Stalin, he actually had a lot of policies in common with Stalin. He was very repressive and very brutal towards anybody that went against his laws, against the policy of communism and the Soviet Union, and he was a very oppressive leader towards his people. But like I said before, at least when it came to relationships between the East and the West, the United States and the Soviet Union, things looked like they were improving. Détente is a name for a series of policies whose goal was to improve relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union. So between 1972 and 1974, there were many meetings between the two nations. There was the Helsinki Accords, which in 1975 was not a formal treaty, but the members of NATO and the Warsaw Pact and 12 other states pledged to work for peace, cooperation, human rights, and also agreed that there'd be certain boundaries that both sides would respect. Now, we'll talk about later how this didn't really end up happening, and this was a huge failure of a policy, of a treaty, but at least they were trying. They were trying to come up with some kind of peaceful resolution to the Cold War. Another extremely important landmark agreement was the SALT talks. There were more than one of these, and these were agreements to eliminate ICBMs and submarines launched with missiles, nuclear missiles. This was all about limiting nuclear weapons. The idea, again, being that both sides were afraid of mutually assured destruction, and this was one way of trying to avert that. Let's stop racing to build up more and more quantities of nuclear weapons that not only could destroy each other, but if stolen, could fall into hands of other parties, because across the globe, there were other fights going on that were absolutely influenced by both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, who were both semi-secretly trying to fight each other's beliefs. For example, we have Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas were a communist group that were revolting against the Somoza family, which was the leadership in Nicaragua that was also supported by the United States. And while it was supported by the United States, it was also a brutal dictatorship. which is what gave someone like Daniel Ortega the popularity and the support to get people to rise up, execute him, and take over Nicaragua, making it a communist country. He actually went so far as to ally with other Latin American communist countries, such as Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba. Meanwhile, while the United States and Soviet Union were focused on each other and the spread or containment of communism, trouble was starting to brew up in the Middle East. Trouble that after the Cold War would start to rapidly become more and more of a security concern and more of a focus for the nations of NATO and eventually the former Warsaw Pact. And that is in Iran. Now, up until about 1979, Iran was known as a relatively peaceful country. Unlike in nations like Nicaragua, where there was a brutal dictatorship and people were suffering, people's quality of life in Iran was not that bad. It was a country that definitely was nowhere near as powerful as, say, England or France or the Soviet Union or America, but definitely not a poor country. This is a country that was, on the surface level, doing well. And yet, it took the world by surprise when all of a sudden there was a revolution led by extreme conservative Muslim groups, the leader of which being Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And he successfully led a revolt against the Shah of Iran, who again was very much a dictator, and just like the Somozas in Nicaragua, supported by the US, and just like in Nicaragua, he was considered to be oppressive by his people, but he wasn't quite the brutal dictator, he wasn't quite the bloody dictator that Somoza in Nicaragua was. Rather, he at some point decided he wanted to make Muslims, which was the majority religion in Iran, the minority, or possibly even eliminating it entirely from the nation. And this, of course, upset the vast majority of his people, who were majority Muslims, which made the nation ripe for revolution and opened the door for an extremist like Khomeini to come in and establish a new, conservative, and much more unpredictable leadership, which would not only pose a threat to nearby nations, but would also make even the United States and Europe feel threatened by this small but powerful nation of Iran. Now, the people of Iran, again, because this was a well-to-do nation, had a lot of very educated people in it, and a lot of very educated people were supporting the revolution for this conservative Muslim leader. And one of the reasons why was not only because they were against the oppressive policies of the former Shah, but also against the United States of America, who they knew were supporting this leader who they felt was oppressing them and their freedom of religion. So impassioned were they against the United States' presence in Iran that a group of students in support of the revolution overran the embassy in Tehran and held 52 American diplomats and citizens for 444 days. That's well over a year. This was a major turning point, not only in the Iran-US relationships, which in the past had been peaceful under the Shah, but between all of the Middle Eastern nations, Western nations, Europe, North America. Iran became, in many nations' eyes, a major threat. And to this very day, Iran is still seen as a threat to much of the Western world. And that's all there is to say in this video. Thank you, and I'll see you in class.